Picture this, October 9th, 2025, thousands of students across Mali walked into their classrooms expecting the usual history lessons. But when they opened their textbooks, something is missing. The French Revolution, gone. Napoleon, erased. Centuries of history that these kids were supposed to memorize were removed officially from their curriculum. Now, before you think this is just about changing some textbooks, let me tell you what's actually happening here. Because this decision is triggering something way bigger than education reform. And here is what surprised me most. France isn't even trying to hide how much this threatens them. The question isn't why Mali just did this. The question is, what took them so long? Alright, so here's what we know on the surface. Mali's government, led by President Assimi Goïta, announced they are removing all French history from 9th grade classrooms. We are talking about the 1789 French Revolution, colonial history, and all of it suspended. Now, the official reason? Mali's Ministry of Education called it intellectual independence. They say they want Malian students learning about the Malian Empire. Timbuktu scholars, leaders like Samori Touare, African history, their own story. Sounds reasonable, right? Teaching kids about their own heritage instead of making them memorize French kings and European revolution. And you know there is more. This isn't happening in a vacuum. There is a reason why France is watching so closely, and it has nothing to do with education quality. Because when Mali's education minister said this was about decolonizing the classroom, they weren't just talking about textbooks. They were talking about money, power, who controls the future. And that's what we need to understand. So let me show you what's really going on here. Now, there is something most people don't know about France and its former colonies. Something that explains why this curriculum change is making waves across West Africa. Former French President Jacques Chirac once said something that got buried in diplomatic archives, but African leaders never forgot. During a 2001 summit in Yaoundé, right here in Cameroon, he actually admitted something striking. He talked about how France has been extracting wealth from Africa for centuries. First through slavery, then raw materials, then destroying African culture with European education systems. And here is the part that connects to Mali's decision today. Chirac said, "We are depriving them of their brains thanks to scholarships, which are definitely another form of exploitation." Now, Pan-African scholars summarized his point like this: when Africans study French, they buy French. Now, think about that. The language you learn, the history you are taught, the heroes you memorize, all of that shapes what you believe is valuable, what you aspire to, what you consume. It's like if you grew up watching only Hollywood movies, listening only to American music, reading only American books, you would probably think American products are superior, right? You would like to buy them, copy their style, speak their language. So, my question for you, if you were leading a country trying to build its own economy, its own industries, its own identity, will you keep teaching your kids to admire someone else's revolution? Mali's government looked at this equation and said, no. But before you think this is just about national pride, wait until you see what else is happening in the background, because France isn't the only player in this game anymore. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Since 2021, Mali has been systematically cutting ties with France. They expelled French troops, kicked out the French ambassador. In 2024, they removed French as an official language. Then in March 2025, they withdrew from the Francophonie organization, the French-speaking bloc. And now, they are rewriting what their children learned in school. This is what is called a complete break. There is an old Wolof proverb: if you want to kill a dog, first make it look rabid. But Mali is doing the opposite. They are not making France look bad. They are just making it disappear from their streets, from their governments, and now from their classrooms. But here is what nobody is reporting loudly enough. While France is losing in Mali, guess who is gaining it? Russia, China, Turkey, Brazil. These aren't just diplomatic partnerships. They are bringing military support, infrastructure deals, and alternative education models. So when Mali removes French history from schools, they are not just creating empty space. They are preparing to fill it with something else. The question is, what? And more importantly, is this the blueprint other African countries are about to follow? Because Mali isn't alone in this, not even close. Ghana, Rwanda, Senegal, Nigeria, they are all looking at their own curriculums right now. Some have already started reforms. Others are debating it publicly. I had a friend in Lagos tell me something interesting. She said, we spent years learning about British kings and queens. We can name all of Henry VIII's wives. But ask us about Queen Amiria of Zaria, Mansa Musa, the Oyo Empire. Most of us learned that from YouTube. That's the disconnect Mali is trying to fix. Now, some historians are pushing back. They are saying, look, the French Revolution gave us concepts like democracy, citizenship, human rights. You can't just erase that from education. Fair point. Understanding how political systems evolve globally has value. But here is the thing, and this is what Mali's leaders are arguing. Why should African kids spend more time studying French liberty and equality when France was actively colonizing and oppressing Africans? At the same time, those ideals were being written. Think about the contradiction here. You are teaching your kids to celebrate freedom fighters in Paris while ignoring freedom fighters in Bamako. You are memorizing dates of European independence while your own ancestors' resistance is a footnote. So here is my question for you. Is this about erasing global history or about finally making African history the main story? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think. Now, let's talk about what France is actually losing here, because it's not nostalgia. Here's what many people out of Africa don't realize. France doesn't just have cultural influence in its former colonies, it has economic infrastructure. French companies dominate telecoms, banking, construction, retail in many Francophone African countries. French is the language of business contracts, university degrees, government administration. And you remember Chirac's point? When you educate people in French, when you make them admire French systems, French thinkers, French revolutions, they grow up believing French products, French standards, French ways of doing things as superior. That's not an accident. That's strategy. So when Mali starts teaching its kids in Bambara instead of French, when they center Malian history instead of European history, what happens? The next generation grows up with different reference points, different heroes, different ideas about what's valuable and what's possible. And that shift, it threatens billions in French economic interests across the region. But here's what makes this even more interesting. France isn't sitting quietly. So I started wondering, does France teach African history to French citizens the way Africa teaches French history to African citizens? And the answer is not even close. In French schools, African history is barely covered. When colonization is mentioned, it's often framed as euphemism, civilizing missions, modernizing efforts. The violence, the extraction, destruction of cultures, minimized or glozed over. Some French textbooks literally had language about the positive role of colonization until 2005, and even after that law was repealed. The curriculum reforms have been slow and insufficient, so Mali is expected to spend classroom hours teaching French history in details. But France doesn't reciprocate. It's a one-way relationship. And you know what the wildest part is? French officials are now publicly criticizing Mali's decision, saying it will make students less globally aware, isolated from global history. The same France that barely teaches African history is lecturing Mali about global awareness. You can't make this stuff up. So let's pull all this together. What's really happening here isn't just about pulling French history from textbooks. For decades, African countries inherited education systems designed by colonial powers. Those systems were built to produce administrators for colonial governments, not independent thinkers or nation builders. They were designed to make African kids see themselves as supporting characters in someone else's story. Mali's Ministry of Education said it plainly. Our history is not a footnote in someone else's story. It's the foundation of our future. And look, this isn't about hating France or erasing global perspectives. It's about balance. It's about centering yourself first before you learn about others. Now, think about this. If you are building a house, you start with the foundation. You don't start with the neighbor's house and then maybe, if there is time, get to your own. Mali is saying, we are building our foundation first. Now, with this work, will Mali's kids be better off learning primary African history? That's the experiments, and honestly, we won't know the full impact for years or maybe a generation. But here is what I am watching. If other countries adopt similar reforms and see similar results, that could change education across the continent. But there is one more layer to this that nobody is talking about, and it might be the most important one. Where do you come from? What stories shape you? What stories shape how you see yourself and your possibilities? I remember being in school and studying about European explorers, discovering places that millions of people already lived. I remember textbooks that made it seem like African history started with colonization, like nothing happened here before Europeans arrived. That does something to you. It makes you feel like your ancestors were passive, that greatness comes from somewhere else, that you are always catching up to standards that someone else set. Mali is saying no to that arrangement. They are telling their kids, you come from the Malian Empire, one of the wealthiest civilizations in human history. You come from Timbuktu, a center of learning when Europe was in the Dark Ages. You come from Samori Touare, who resisted colonization for years. That's not propaganda, that's true history. And learning it first doesn't make you ignorant of the world. It makes you confident enough to engage with the world as an equal. Some people worry this could become nationalist or insular. That's a valid concern because balance matters. But right now, the imbalance has been the other way for so long that Mali's decision feels less like closing off and more like opening up space for African students to see themselves clearly. So here is where we are. Mali bans French history from schools. On the surface, it's an education reform, but underneath, it's the declaration of sovereignty. It's the break from neocolonial influence. It's a bet that centering African identity will build stronger and more confident citizens. And whether you think this is brilliant or risky, one thing is clear. This is a move that other countries are watching closely. Now here is the takeaway I want you to sit with. If you are in the diaspora, if you are watching African countries reclaim their narratives, their resources, their futures, the question for you is this: are you just observing from a distance, or are you part of the rebuilding? Because what Mali is doing in education, other countries are doing in infrastructure, in tech, in agriculture, in finance. The wave of African self-determination isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. So when you see these changes happening, when you see African countries making bold moves, ask yourself, how can I contribute? How can I invest? How can I be part of this chapter? Instead of just commenting on it, drop your thoughts below. Are you in the camp that thinks Mali's decision is a step forward for real independence? Or do you think there is a risk of isolating students from global perspectives? I'm genuinely curious and I read every comment.